Well, South Africa has commemorated the 44th anniversary on Black Wednesday, when the apartheid government banned independent media in an attempt to hide and gag atrocities committed by the then regime in 1977. Today we focus on the challenges facing female reporters in doing their jobs. Joining us is veteran journalist and author Nomavenda Mathiane, specialist investigative journalist Karyn Maughan, and Voice of It student journalist Aphelele Boqwana. And of course we're also expected to be joined by news and crime reporter Promise Marupeng. Good evening to all of you ladies. It's a pleasure to be able to host you tonight and to actually have this conversation, because it comes at an important time. We've seen such a big push for the transformation of the media industry, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But perhaps if we can start by how you believe that the industry has changed over the years, as somebody who came into this game as a young black reporter and has now been able to build a name for themselves.
Actually, I'm excited that there are people like you who are occupying such important positions in the media. I mean, when we were doing this job, we were down there on the piles. It was men who were occupying managerial positions. You know, they were the ones who were doing anchor jobs. They were the gatekeepers. They were the ones who were in the forefront of the media. So today you have people like Kathy, you know, you have people like Karyn, who are doing a great job. People like Gyoko, who's this woman at ETV, Gyokos. I follow her so much.
Oh, Heidi Gyokos.
Yes, I love her. I follow her so much. But there are so many women, young women, who are almost like young girls. Young women who are doing a great job, who are really holding the candle. And I'm proud.
And you know, it's a job that is not without its pitfalls, and perhaps you can reflect on that a little bit for us. What do you believe have been some of the big challenges that you have faced through the span of your career?
Look, there were many challenges, but you know, it's sometimes not right just to focus on one profession, because I mean, discrimination was happening in all the professions. You know, you had teachers who had female teachers who didn't feature as head of departments. They were just teachers. I think the only women who survived, you know, who were in positions of power were nurses, because you had nursing sisters, you had matrons. But in the rest of the professions, in corporate, for instance, the men were managers. There were no black female managers. So much has happened in this profession.
Karyn, I want to bring you in here at this point, because, you know, we talk about how there has been the inclusion of more women, at least across the racial divide, more diversity when it comes to having women in newsrooms. But the reality is that when we look at senior management of who runs newsrooms, but most importantly, who owns newsrooms, some of those figures have changed just marginally.
I think one of the biggest issues is that there are very few black women in managerial positions in newsrooms, despite the fact that they make up the vast bulk of the reporting body. And I think that is a massive issue. And I also think that, you know, the spaces that we allow for commentary and analysis are particularly, unfortunately, dominated by men, and to many respects, you know, dominated by white men in many instances. And that is not helpful to transformation. I think that, you know, one of the biggest issues, there is so much brilliance out there, but when you have a fundamentally unequal system like apartheid, which is basically designed to, you know, deny opportunities to the vast majority of people, to really address that, you need to make spaces and make them in a very powerful way for you know, the opinion makers to start representing the demography of this country. And I think, particularly in terms of black female commentators, there are some brilliant women out there who are making major inroads in that space, but they are not enough. And particularly in my beat, which is legal journalism, where you have so much excellence, young black excellence like Junaid Shabalala out there, those women should be coming to the front, and they should be getting the kind of profile that they deserve.
So, Karyn, why is it then, if the majority of reporters in newsrooms would be women, that we don't see this reflected in the news production? Because, Media Monitoring Africa has done quite a lot of research on this, and they do show that even during a time such as election, I mean, if you look at the voters' roll, you've got 55% women that are registered to vote in the elections. But guess what? When you analyze who is represented in the media, the majority of those numbers are skewed towards men. So it's not just the men who are the politicians, it's also the men who are providing most of the interviews. They're really setting the narrative. Why is that?
I think we have to acknowledge that part of the racist apartheid project was a particularly misogynistic project. And I think that, if we look at the rates of GBV that occur against South African women, if we look at the fact that a South African woman is more likely to die at the hands of her partner, a man who professes to love her, than to die, for example, in a car accident, we have to acknowledge that our society is fundamentally still very broken along gender lines. And while there might be a kind of constitutional, legal, and sort of social commitment to addressing that, the fact of the matter is that, the face of poverty in South Africa is still black and female. And so you have these kind of massive rifts in terms of access to opportunity, but, schismed across these lines of, both racism and gender dynamics. And we have to start addressing that. And I think that a lot of it has to do with, yes, policy, but also environments that enable women, black women, to feel empowered to speak their minds, to feel that they have a space, that they have the ability to vocalize, to have an opinion without necessarily being, seen as problematic in news environments, which I think is unfortunately a phenomenon that has happened in certain instances, and it's not helpful, and it doesn't enable a democratically thriving environment to grow and to become far more representative of the country that we belong to.
Aphelele Boqwana, let me come to you. You are a student journalist at Voice of Wits. That's my alma mater. I also started out at Voice of Wits. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to become a journalist.
Okay, one of the reasons why I wanted to become a journalist is because I love writing. Besides the fact that I'm noisy, I like, interviewing people, to be precise. So that was like one of the things that attracted me to venture into journalism space.
And as you do your work at Voice of Wits and you're able to really represent some of the issues and the challenges facing students, what have you found to be the one thing you didn't expect about being a journalist?
Okay, so I would love to say that one of the prominent challenges that I had to face this year, especially as a young female journalism, is the fact that young female journalists or reporters are likely to be attacked, especially by the public or on the streets or by social media. So that was like one of the most challenges that I had to face.
Tell us what happened. What was your experience, or what have been some of your experiences?
Okay, so at the beginning of this year, I think in March, on the 10th of March, I was shot by the police officials while reporting on the scene. There was a vet protest, and I was reporting personally for the Voice of Vets radio station, and I got shot. And I think that's one of like I think that's like one of the most challenges that reporters face. Police officials, I would like to say that they are the threat to journalists.
And you know, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, Aphelele, and it's an experience that so many journalists can be able to identify with, because oftentimes, sometimes even if you are there to tell the story, you find yourself seemingly on opposing ends with the state and with the protesters whose protests you're there to cover. You know, and this, of course, again, has an impact on how many women actually stay in the field. Nomavenda?
Well, I mean, this job comes with, it's a hazardous job. It's not for the faint-hearted. If you want to be a journalist, you must know that you are actually putting yourself there for all sorts of terrible things that might happen to you. And also what I found out as I was reporting as a young journalist, you know, we need media literacy amongst our people, because they view journalists as abondaba, you know. So they come, that people have an attitude sometimes to say, abondaba, you know. So we have to settle so many roads, you know, as journalists, you know, because we are not understood.
Did you have any experiences personally
that
have been threatening?
Of course.
What's the one that comes to mind?
There are so many of them. So, I mean, one time I was doing a story we had the police were against us. We had the activists who didn't understand why we were asking them questions. So we're always in trouble. And of course, we had a problem with our news editors who wouldn't believe some of the stories that we're telling them coming from the townships. But having said all that, I just want us to look at the good things that came out of journalists, black journalism. We were part of a community. We were respected. We were part of the chain of professionals. So if there was a problem, the community knew who they would call. So we were not operating in isolation. And we didn't see ourselves only as journalists. We were the community. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I'm explaining myself well, because while we were experiencing discrimination in the newsroom, but when we went out, we met these people who not, I wouldn't say in awe of us, but who felt that we were part of them. So when anything happened, they knew what to do. For instance, I remember one night I got a call from a young doctor. He's not so young anymore, Dr. Soli Rataimane. He was working at the Boqwana casualty, and there came in a group of men who had been assaulted by their boss. He took pictures of those guys, he called me, and we did a story. So we were connected as journalists. We're part of the community.
And that's really important, because, again, it speaks to the levels of trust that the community has in the work that journalists do. And when the community feels that the work that journalists are doing is not representative of their lived realities, it breaks that trust, and it leads to part of the situation that we're seeing today, at least if we look at some of the research that is being conducted. We're going to continue our conversation with the journalists that are joining me tonight as we commemorate Black Wednesday. Commemorating Black Wednesday, joining us for our conversation today, author and veteran journalist Nomavenda Mathiane, specialist investigative reporter Karyn Maughan, and Voice of Wits student journalist Aphelele Boqwana. And of course, we're also still expecting that Primrose will be able to join the conversation. Karyn, I wanted to bring you into this part of the conversation where we talk about the challenges that reporters, that journalists actually face. Aphelele spoke about the way in which she was caught up in the crossfire, shot by police while covering a protest. But we're also seeing these attacks not just being physical, but also being emotional. And I think you can speak to some of that.
I think the thing is that as both Aphelele and Nomavenda were pointing out, when you're in reality and you get to engage with communities and people and police or whatever, you have the opportunity to kind of negotiate with them, to hear their concerns, which are often very valid, and to understand where they're coming from and what apprehensions they might have. But the unfortunate reality is now that in the age of social media, oftentimes when people are coming after you in a social media space, for example, they're not really interested in a dialogue. They're just solely focused on threatening you, harassing you, intimidating you, and silencing you. And unfortunately, disproportionately, a lot of that abuse is directed at female journalists. Generally, women tend to be far more targeted on social media platforms than their male counterparts, though men are also targeted. And the level of, abuse that women are subjected to, and you point out that I've personally kind of experienced some of this, is quite horrific. And unfortunately, there are not, while social media spaces are trying to become more stringent about these kind of aspects of how they operate and the way people are allowed or enabled to be abusive, there's very little that you can do if someone threatens your life or threatens your well-being or your family. You've just got to kind of, take it in, report it, and carry on. And I think particularly for young journalists like Aphelele, social media can oftentimes be extremely, abuse on social media can be very, very devastating. And my great concern is that a lot of the voices that we need to be building up, we need to be supporting, and we need to be enabling to come out and speak and report are being silenced because of the kind of fear of backlash that they have as a consequence of the social media environment that we're dealing with.
And Nomavenda, you spoke earlier, Nomavenda, about the ability of being heard in a newsroom and the kind of discrimination that existed and that has existed in newsrooms. Do you think that that has changed at all?
I don't know, because I've not been inside the newsroom for many years. I've not been in any of the newspapers for many, many years. But looking from the number of women who are employed and who are doing a great job, I think things are getting better. But I think things won't get better because we want them to get better. We have to get our journalists to educate themselves, to better themselves. You have to fight for that space. Look, if we didn't work as hard as we did those days, you guys would not be there. Absolutely. We had to work so that they must know that this is doable. Women can do this. So women can be taken on as journalists. So I just think we need to have this quality of sound journalists. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying we have to exert ourselves. If we were to get anywhere, because men are not going to give it to us on a platter. We are going to have to, you guys are going to have to fight for recognition.
Promise, let me bring you in here, and thanks for being able to join us. Promise Marupeng is a news and crime reporter. This is for one of the country's biggest daily publications, the Sowetan. Promise, I hope you've been able to listen in a little bit on the conversation that we've been having. And we're looking now at this issue of discrimination in newsrooms and just the extent to which discrimination still exists, and the ability of women to be able to speak up when they do face challenges. You are in what is generally a tough beat, so I'm sure you've got a lot to say on the subject.
Yes, look, all of everything that has been said is very true. Shockingly, we are not received well in communities, the same communities that we serve. You get a lot of, intimidation, bullying on the ground, and there's lack of empowerment and transformation in the newsrooms, do you understand? So we find ourselves as young journalists, even afraid to speak up because you are seen as forward. The silence has been compelling because, you see the things happen to your senior colleagues. You see them happen to people that work in other publications. And you also find yourselves in those situations. And until it personally happens to you, you will not understand this. But I say, as journalists, we work very hard, especially the roles that we play in our communities and in society. But we are still not received well. On and off the pitch, we suffer, bullying, we suffer intimidation, and because we are already vulnerable, that is used against us. It takes a very strong person to speak up and to also fight for what you want, because I personally don't want to work, as a basic journalist until I'm 60 years old. I want to make a difference. And sometimes my voice is not heard because I'm not strong enough, or maybe I am not, I haven't been around in the industry for too long. But sadly, those things happen, and we face them daily. I'm a young mom, but you find yourself having to, juggle being a mother, a single mother, and being a journalist. And when things go wrong, you're all alone. When things get hard, you're all alone, because the silence has been in the industry made normal. It's a norm. And when you try to break out of it, you are then victimized or seen as forward. And I feel that those things need to change so that we also consider having long-term careers in journalism. Yeah. Most people jump ship and they end up, going for PR jobs. They end up going for other, jobs. But in essence, if journalism would be more friendlier, would be more, empowering to women, we would stay. We would not consider leaving earlier, or even, my biggest fear is dying as a pauper, because then I'm underpaid and I feel overworked at times. But who do I tell? Because I arrived, things were like this, and we hope that somehow, media owners can look at changing these things for us for the future.
Promise, part of what you said is so important around why it is that especially female journalists seem to have a lifespan in the newsroom. So beyond a certain age, it's very rare to find older women who are still practicing journalism or who are even serving in some of the senior structures. What are the kind of conversations that you've found yourself having to have, especially being a young mom, while at the same time you have to show up for all of these crazy deadlines? You're always on call, because really, if your editor calls you, you don't have a choice but to answer that phone.
Yes, definitely. Look, I think my son is 11, and I can't even think of having more children, because I can't also give him enough attention, or his schoolwork, or look at extending my family or expanding and having more kids, because I have tight deadlines. I travel a lot. And, the thought of being away from home and leaving him with strangers also leaves me, not at ease. But unfortunately, I have had to find ways. You pay for extra care, extra classes, and you hate doing that as a mom, having to pay for everything for a child. You want to be hands-on, but it doesn't allow you, Your job doesn't allow you. The industry is a very fast-paced environment. You cannot drop the ball. You cannot leave a story and attend, things at the same time, family things at the same time. So it's either you take time off work and, focus on your personal things.
All right. Aphelele, I want to come back to you. We'll wrap up the conversation with you, Nomavenda. But, you're listening to some of the journalists that are perhaps a bit older than you, that have been in the newsroom. And just on this issue of feeling like you have a voice, how do you manage that at such a young age? And what are the kind of conversations that you have with your colleagues?
I would say that, okay, just to put an input on what had Promise said, I feel like we need the MDDA especially to like play a role, not only when they're passing message from the government, but also to like fund community media platforms. Sort of like a skill development skill kind of type. Yeah. Yes. And also with the Department of Education, I feel like it also needs to offer it also, needs to offer media-related subjects, especially to public schools, so that when kids from school want to venture into media spaces, they know what to do.
Okay.
They know which course to take, and how is that going to benefit them.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there. I know I said I was going to give you time to wrap up, but I've got my producer in my ear saying we're way over time. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there with this conversation. Thank you so much for being part of it.